It was 2:30 in the morning when the river broke free. Within 45 minutes, the water climbed more than 25 feet. At the girls' summer camp by the Guadalupe River, laughter turned to panic, joy turned to terror. What happened in those fateful hours on July 4th, 2025? And why? Did no one see it coming? Tonight, we trace the storm. We follow the surge. And we uncover the failures. Hidden beneath the wave, in the heart of central Texas, lies a place known to meteorologists as Flash Flood Alley. It's a name that sounds almost poetic, almost beautiful. But there's nothing beautiful about what that name really means. The Texas Hill Country? Rolling limestone hills, steep valleys, dry riverbeds that snake through the landscape like ancient scars. This is a land built on rock, hard rock, limestone bedrock that doesn't absorb water the way soil does in other parts of the country. When rain falls here, it doesn't sink in. It runs, fast, furious, unstoppable. The Guadalupe River winds through Kerr County like a ribbon of silver, calm most days, almost lazy in the summer heat. Families float down it on inner tubes, kids splash in the shallows. Camp counselors lead sing-alongs on its banks. For decades, the river has been a friend to this community, a source of joy, of life, of memory. But on the night of July 4th, 2025, the river became something else entirely. Just outside the little town of Hunt, population barely 1,000 souls, sat Camp Mystic, an all-girls summer camp founded generations ago, built right along the riverbank. Cabins painted cheerful colors, a dining hall where campers gathered for meals and ghost stories, a dock where they learned to canoe. This was a place built for laughter, for friendship, for the kind of memories that last a lifetime. That night, water wrote another story. More than 100 young girls were sleeping in those cabins. Counselors, many of them barely out of their teens themselves, were responsible for keeping them safe. They'd done the drills. They'd checked the weather. Everything seemed normal. Just another summer night in the hill country. But above them, in the atmosphere, something extraordinary was taking shape. Let me take you back a few days. July 2nd, 2025. The Texas Division of Emergency Management, TDEM, activates state emergency response resources. It's a precautionary move, the kind of thing they do when the forecast looks uncertain. Heavy rain is predicted for west and central Texas. Nothing unusual for summer. Thunderstorms are common. The alert goes out, but it doesn't carry the weight of urgency. Not yet. July 3rd. The National Weather Service issues a flood watch for Kerr County and surrounding areas. Again, this is standard procedure. The hill country gets these watches several times a year. Most of the time, nothing happens. A few inches of rain, maybe some street flooding in low-lying areas, and then the sun comes back out. But this time was different. A mid-level atmospheric vortex, spinning slowly over the region, had collided with moisture streaming up from the Gulf of Mexico. Remnants of Tropical Storm Barry, which had dissipated days earlier, were being pulled into the system. Warm, humid air was rising, condensing, forming towering thunderstorm cells that began to stack on top of each other like building blocks. Meteorologists call this training. When storm cells move over the same area again and again and again, dumping rain in the same location for hours. It's one of the most dangerous weather patterns for flash flooding, and on the night of July 3rd into July 4th, the storms trained directly over the Guadalupe River watershed. Now, here's where the geology becomes critical. The Texas Hill Country sits on what's called the Edwards Plateau. It's a massive limestone formation, millions of years old, carved by ancient rivers and weathered by time. Limestone is porous, yes, but when you have steep slopes and thin soil cover, water doesn't have time to percolate down. It hits the surface and immediately starts flowing downhill. And here's the cruel irony. The region had been in a drought. Weeks of hot, dry weather had baked the soil hard. When rain finally came, the ground was like concrete. The water couldn't sink in even if it wanted to. Every drop that fell became runoff, racing downhill toward the river. Imagine pouring water onto a parking lot. That's essentially what was happening across thousands of square miles of hill country. And all of that water, was funneling into the Guadalupe River. By midnight on July 4th, the rain had begun in earnest. Not the gentle patter of a summer shower, but a roar, sheets of water falling so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. Thunder cracked like artillery fire. Lightning turned the night into day, again and again and again. At Camp Mystic, some of the girls woke up. The sound of rain on the cabin roofs was loud, almost deafening. A few counselors checked their phones, but cell service in the area was spotty at best. Some cabins had a policy of collecting phones at night anyway, to encourage the girls to disconnect, to be present, to enjoy the camp experience. No one was checking the river gauge. No one was monitoring the National Weather Service alerts in real time. Why would they? This was supposed to be a safe place. A place where parents sent their daughters to learn and grow and make friends. A place where the biggest worry was whether it would rain during the talent show. But outside, in the darkness, the river was rising. At 3:45 a.m., the gauge at Hunt recorded something that should have been impossible. In just 45 minutes, the Guadalupe River rose 26 feet. 26 feet. That's the height of a 2-story building in less than an hour. The gauge, an automated sensor that transmits data to the National Weather Service, climbed and climbed and climbed. And then, at approximately 5:10 a.m., it stopped updating. Either it had been swept away, or the water had risen so high it exceeded the gauge's maximum reading. Later, investigators would estimate the river crested at nearly 38 feet above its normal level. 38 feet of churning, debris-filled water, moving at speeds of 15-20 miles per hour. Trees were ripped from the banks. Vehicles were tossed like toys, and anything in the river's path didn't stand a chance. At Camp Mystic, the first sign of trouble came around 4 a.m. A counselor, waking to use the bathroom, noticed water seeping under the cabin door. Not a trickle, a flood. She screamed, waking the girls, and within seconds the cabin was in chaos. Other cabins closer to the river were already underwater. The surge had come so fast, so violently, that there was no time to evacuate. Girls were climbing onto bunk beds, onto tables, anything to get above the rising water. Counselors were shouting, trying to keep everyone calm, but the sound of the river was overwhelming. A roar like a freight train, like the end of the world. Some cabins were swept off their foundations entirely, wood and metal and screaming voices all swallowed by the black water. In the darkness, it was impossible to see, impossible to know who was safe and who was gone. One survivor, a 14-year-old girl, would later describe it in a voice barely above a whisper. I held onto a tree branch for I don't know how long. My hands were bleeding. I could hear people calling for help, but I couldn't see them. I just held on. I didn't think I was going to make it. Across Kerr County, the same nightmare was unfolding. In the town of Kerrville, water poured through streets, into homes, into businesses. Cars were submerged up to their roofs. Families climbed into attics, then onto roofs, waving flashlights and cell phones, praying someone would see them. Emergency services were overwhelmed. 911 lines were jammed. Dispatchers were taking calls from people trapped in rising water, and there was nothing they could do. No boats, no helicopters, not yet. The storm was still raging. Visibility was near zero. Rescue teams couldn't launch until first light. And so, people waited, in the dark, in the rain, listening to the water rise. By dawn on July 4th, the rain had finally begun to ease. The storm cells, after hours of relentless downpour, were moving east. But the damage was already done. As the sun rose, the scale of the disaster became clear. The Guadalupe River, normally a peaceful waterway, maybe 50 feet wide, had swollen to half a mile across in some places. Entire neighborhoods were underwater. Bridges had collapsed. Roads were impassable, buried under mud and debris. And at Camp Mystic, the scene was apocalyptic. Cabins were gone, simply gone, swept away as if they had never existed. Trees were stripped bare, their branches tangled with clothing, backpacks, pieces of furniture. The riverbank, once a gentle slope where girls had sat and dangled their feet in the water, was now a cliff, carved away by the force of the flood. Rescue helicopters began arriving around 6 a.m. Pilots, many of them volunteers, flew low over the floodwaters, searching for survivors. They found them clinging to trees, huddled on rooftops, waving frantically. One by one, people were lifted to safety, wrapped in blankets, taken to hospitals or shelters. But for every person rescued, there were others who weren't. Bodies were found downstream, miles from where they'd been swept away. Some were never found at all. By July 6th, 2 days after the flood, the death toll had climbed past 100. More than 160 people were reported missing in Kerr County alone. Rescue operations continued, but hope was fading. The river had carried victims far downstream, into remote areas where search teams couldn't easily reach. The media descended on the hill country. News helicopters circled overhead. Reporters stood in front of destroyed homes, interviewing survivors, asking the question everyone wanted answered. How did this happen? How did a summer camp, a place built for children, end up in the path of a killer flood? And more importantly, why didn't anyone see it coming? The question of warning systems, of why people weren't evacuated, of why Camp Mystic was even allowed to operate in a flood zone. These questions would dominate the investigation in the weeks to come. But first, we need to understand the science. We need to understand what made this flood so deadly, so fast, so utterly catastrophic. Flash floods are, by definition, rapid. They occur within 6 hours of heavy rainfall, often much faster. But even by flash flood standards, what happened in the hill country was extreme. The rate of rise, the sheer volume of water, the speed at which it moved, all of it was off the charts. Experts would later estimate that some areas received 11 inches of rain in less than 6 hours. 11 inches. To put that in perspective, the average annual rainfall for parts of the hill country is around 30 inches. In one night, they got more than a third of a year's worth of rain. And because of the geology, because of the drought, because of the steep slopes and the limestone bedrock, every drop of that rain became a weapon. Dr. Sarah Chen, a hydrologist at the University of Texas, was one of the first scientists to arrive in the area after the flood. She'd spent her career studying flash floods, but even she was stunned by what she saw. The erosion patterns were unlike anything I'd encountered, she said, her voice measured but tinged with disbelief. The river had carved new channels, moved boulders the size of cars, stripped soil down to bedrock in places. The energy required to do that, it's almost incomprehensible. This wasn't just a flood. This was a geologic event. Dr. Chen and her team set up monitoring equipment, collected samples, interviewed survivors. They wanted to understand not just what happened, but why. And what they found was troubling. Climate change. 2 words that have become almost politicized. But here's the thing. The science doesn't care about politics. The data doesn't care about opinions. And the data, in this case, is clear. Warmer air holds more moisture. For every degree Celsius the atmosphere warms, it can hold about 7% more water vapor. That means when storms form, they have more fuel. They can dump more rain in a shorter period of time. And that's exactly what happened in Texas. The remnants of Tropical Storm Barry, pulling moisture from the Gulf, fed into a system that was already primed for extreme rainfall. The result was a storm that produced rainfall rates of 2 to 3 inches per hour for several hours straight. That's not normal. That's not something the hill country's infrastructure or its warning systems were designed to handle. And here's the terrifying part. This is becoming more common. Extreme rainfall events, the kind that used to happen once every 100 years, are now happening once every 20 years, once every 10 years. The rules are changing, and we're not keeping up. But climate change alone doesn't explain why so many people died. It doesn't explain why Camp Mystic, a place that had operated for decades, was caught so completely off guard. For that, we need to look at the warning systems, or, rather, the lack of them. The National Weather Service had issued a flood watch on July 3rd. That's the lowest level of alert, essentially saying conditions are favorable for flooding, be aware. But a flood watch doesn't trigger evacuations. It doesn't shut down camps or close roads. It's just a heads up. As the rain intensified overnight, the NWS upgraded the alert to a flash flood warning. That's more serious. It means flooding is imminent or already occurring. But here's the problem. That warning was issued at 3:55 a.m. By that time, the river was already rising. People were already in danger. And in the middle of the night, in a rural area with spotty cell service, how many people actually saw that warning? At Camp Mystic, there was no emergency alert system tied directly to river gauges, no siren, no automated call, no text message blast. The camp relied on staff to monitor conditions, but the staff were asleep. And even if they'd been awake, even if they'd seen the warning, would there have been time to evacuate? Investigators would later determine that the answer was maybe. If the evacuation had started at 3 a.m., before the river began its catastrophic rise, most people could have been moved to higher ground. But that would have required someone to be monitoring the gauges in real time, to recognize the danger, to make the call to wake everyone up and move them in the middle of the night. No one made that call, and by the time the danger was obvious, it was too late. The question that haunted everyone in those first days after the flood was simple, brutal, and impossible to answer with any satisfaction. Could this have been prevented? Not the rain, not the storm. Those were acts of nature, forces beyond human control. But the deaths, the missing children, the families torn apart, those might have been preventable. And that realization, that terrible knowledge, hung over the hill country like a second storm cloud. Let's talk about the camp itself. Camp Mystic, a beloved institution, a place where generations of Texas girls had spent their summers. The camp had been operating since 1947, nearly 80 years of tradition. In all that time, there had never been a flood like this, never even close. But here's what investigators discovered when they started digging into the records. The camp was in a flood zone, not a minor one, not a maybe if we get a really bad storm zone. It was in what FEMA designates as a special flood hazard area, specifically Zone AE. That means there's a 1% chance of flooding in any given year, what they call the 100-year floodplain. Now, 1% sounds small, right? But think about it this way. If you operate a camp for 80 years in a 100-year floodplain, the odds that you'll experience a major flood during that time are actually pretty high. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And yet, Camp Mystic had no flood evacuation plan that was regularly practiced, no elevated safe zones, no automatic alert system tied to river gauges. The camp's emergency procedures focused on things like severe weather, medical emergencies, lost campers. But catastrophic flooding? That wasn't on the radar. Why not? Part of the answer lies in something psychologists call normalcy bias. It's the tendency to believe that because something has never happened before, it won't happen. We see it all the time in disaster scenarios. People who live on fault lines but don't prepare for earthquakes. Coastal residents who don't evacuate for hurricanes because we've always been fine before. The staff at Camp Mystic, the board of directors, the parents who sent their daughters there. They all suffered from normalcy bias. The river had always been safe. It had always been a source of joy, not danger. And so, even though the maps said they were in a flood zone, even though the science said flash floods were a risk in the hill country, it just didn't feel real until it was. On July 7th, 3 days after the flood, Texas Governor Maria Gonzalez held a press conference. She stood at a podium in Austin, flanked by emergency management officials, her face drawn with exhaustion and grief. The loss of life we have witnessed in the hill country is devastating, she said, her voice catching slightly. More than 135 of our fellow Texans are confirmed dead. 2 are still missing. Hundreds more are injured, displaced, traumatized. This is one of the worst natural disasters in our state's history. She paused, taking a breath. And when she continued, her tone had shifted. There was anger there now, barely controlled. We are launching a full investigation into the warning systems, the emergency response protocols, and the decisions made in the hours leading up to this tragedy. We owe it to the victims, to their families, to understand what went wrong and to make sure it never happens again. The room erupted with questions from reporters. Why wasn't the camp evacuated? Why didn't the alerts reach people in time? Who was responsible? Governor Gonzales raised a hand, calling for quiet. I don't have all the answers yet, but I promise you, we will get them. The investigation that followed would take months, but some findings emerged quickly, and they painted a picture of a system that was fragmented, underfunded, overwhelmed. Let's start with the river gauges. The Guadalupe River had several automated gauges that measured water levels and transmitted data to the National Weather Service in real time. These gauges are critical for flash flood warnings. They are the eyes on the ground, the early warning system that tells forecasters when a river is rising dangerously fast. But here's the problem. The gauge at Hunt, the one closest to Camp Mystic, was OLD. It had been installed in the 1990s and hadn't been upgraded in years. It was designed to measure water levels up to about 30 feet. When the river rose above that, the gauge simply stopped working. It couldn't transmit data, it wasn't built to capture. So at the exact moment when accurate, real-time information was most critical, the system went blind. And it gets worse. Even if the gauge had been working, even if it had transmitted data showing a catastrophic rise, there was no automated system to push that information directly to people in the affected area. The National Weather Service issued warnings, yes, but those warnings went out through channels like TV, radio, weather apps, and the emergency alert system on cell phones. In the middle of the night, in a rural area, how many people had their TVs on? How many were listening to the radio? And cell service, as I mentioned, was spotty at best. Some areas had no service at all. The emergency alert system relies on cell towers, and when those towers are overwhelmed or damaged by the storm, the alerts don't get through. There's a term in emergency management, the last mile problem. It refers to the challenge of getting critical information from authorities to the people who actually need it. You can have the best forecasting models in the world, the most sophisticated warning systems, but if the message doesn't reach the person standing in harm's way, it's useless. The Texas flood of 2025 was a textbook case of the last mile problem. The information existed, the warnings were issued, but they didn't reach the people at Camp Mystic, or the families sleeping in their homes along the river, or the travelers caught on flooded roads. Not in time, not when it mattered. Let me introduce you to Maria Santos. She was a counselor at Camp Mystic, 22 years old, a college student studying elementary education. She'd been a camper herself as a kid, and had come back as a counselor because she loved the place, loved working with the girls. On the night of July 4th, Maria was responsible for a cabin of 12 girls, ages 10 to 13. When the water started coming in, she did everything right. She got the girls onto the top bunks, kept them calm, told them help was coming. But the water kept rising, and rising, and rising. Eventually, the cabin started to shift. The foundation, weakened by the current, began to give way. Maria made a split-second decision. She told the girls to hold hands, to stay together, and she led them out of the cabin into the water. It was pitch black. The current was ferocious. Maria held on to two girls, one on each arm, and tried to swim toward higher ground. She could hear the other girls behind her, screaming, crying, calling her name. She made it to a tree, a big oak that was still standing, and she pulled the two girls up into the branches. Then she went back, into the water, into the darkness, to find the others. She saved 4 more girls that night, 4 out of 12. When rescue helicopters found them the next morning, Maria was still in the tree, her arms wrapped around the girls, her body shaking with cold and exhaustion. She couldn't speak, she just held them. The other 6 girls from her cabin were found downstream over the next few days. None of them survived. Maria's story is just one story. There are dozens more like it. Counselors who became heroes, campers who showed incredible bravery, and families who lost everything. Take the Hernandez family. They lived in a house about a mile from the river in what they thought was a safe area. They'd checked the flood maps when they bought the house 10 years earlier. They weren't in the floodplain. They were fine, except the flood maps were outdated. They'd been drawn based on historical data, on floods that had happened in the 1970s and 80s. They didn't account for the changes in rainfall patterns, the increased intensity of storms, The way development upstream had altered water flow. When the Guadalupe River jumped its banks, it didn't follow the path the maps predicted. It carved a new path, straight through the Hernandez family's neighborhood. Roberto Hernandez, the father, woke to water pouring through the front door. He grabbed his wife, Elena, and their 2 kids, and they ran for the attic. They made it. Barely. They huddled there for hours, listening to the water destroy their home below them, praying the roof would hold. It did. They survived. But when they finally climbed down the next day, their house was gone. Not damaged. Gone. The walls had collapsed. The furniture, the photos, the kids' toys, Elena's grandmother's wedding dress that she'd kept in a cedar chest. All of it swept away. Roberto stood in the mud where his living room used to be, and he just broke down. "We did everything right," he said, his voice raw. "We checked the maps. We bought insurance. We thought we were safe. How do you prepare for something that's not supposed to happen?" That question, how do you prepare for something that's not supposed to happen, became the central theme of the investigation. Because the truth is, this flood wasn't supposed to happen. Not according to the models. Not according to the historical record. But it did happen. And the reason it happened has everything to do with a changing climate. Let me bring in Dr. James Whitfield, a climate scientist at Texas A&M University. He's spent the last 20 years studying extreme weather events, and he was part of the team that analyzed the meteorological conditions behind the Texas flood. What we saw on July 4th was a confluence of factors that, individually, aren't that unusual, Dr. Whitfield explained in an interview. You had a mid-level vortex, tropical moisture, training thunderstorms. We see these things all the time, but the intensity, the sheer amount of rainfall in such a short period, that's what was extraordinary. He pulled up a graph on his laptop, showing rainfall rates over time. Look at this. At the peak of the storm, we were seeing rainfall rates of 3 inches per hour, sustained, for multiple hours. That's almost unheard of for this region. I asked him, "Is this climate change?" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We can't say that climate change caused this specific storm. Weather is chaotic, and individual events are influenced by many factors. But what we can say, with a high degree of confidence, is that climate change made a storm like this more likely and more intense." He explained it this way. The atmosphere is warmer now than it was 50 years ago. Warmer air holds more moisture. The Gulf of Mexico, which feeds moisture into storms like this one, is warmer than it used to be. That means more evaporation, more water vapor in the air, more fuel for storms. Think of it like this, Dr. Whitfield said. Climate change didn't create the storm, but it supercharged it. It took a bad situation and made it catastrophic. And here's the thing that should terrify all of us. This is the new normal. Extreme rainfall events are becoming more common, not just in Texas, but everywhere. The 100-year flood? It's not a 100-year flood anymore. It might be a 50-year flood, a 20-year flood. In some places, it's happening multiple times in a decade. Our infrastructure, our warning systems, our flood maps, they're all based on the OLD normal. They're based on historical data that no longer applies. And until we update them, until we adapt to this new reality, we're going to keep seeing tragedies like this. Let's talk about the rescue operations, because amidst all the tragedy, there were moments of incredible heroism. The Texas National Guard deployed more than 2,000 personnel to the hill country in the days following the flood. They brought helicopters, high-water vehicles, boats, medical supplies. They worked around the clock, pulling people from rooftops, searching through debris, delivering food and water to stranded communities. Local volunteers showed up by the hundreds. People with boats, with trucks, with nothing but a willingness to help. They formed impromptu rescue teams, navigating flooded streets, checking on neighbors, pulling strangers from the water. One volunteer, a man named Jake Morrison, saved 11 people on July 4th alone. He'd been out fishing when the rain started, and instead of heading home, he spent the entire night motoring through flooded neighborhoods, looking for anyone who needed help. "I didn't even think about it," he said later, shrugging off the praise. "You see someone in trouble, You help. That's what you do. But even with all that effort, even with thousands of people working to save lives, it wasn't enough. The flood had been too fast, too powerful, too overwhelming. By mid-July, the confirmed death toll stood at 135. 2 people were still missing. Their bodies never recovered. The majority of the dead were from Camp Mystic. 47 campers and counselors. 47 young lives snuffed out in a single night. The funerals stretched on for weeks. Churches across Texas held memorial services. Entire communities came together to grieve, to support the families, to try to make sense of the senseless. At one service, in a small church in Kerrville, a mother stood at the podium to speak about her daughter. Her name was Emily, and she'd been 12 years old. She loved horses, loved reading, loved her friends at camp. The mother's voice was steady at first, but as she spoke, it began to crack. She was so excited to go to camp this summer. She'd been counting down the days. She packed her bag a week early. She couldn't wait. She paused, wiping her eyes. I keep thinking, if I just said no, if I just kept her home, she'd still be here. She'd be alive. The church was silent except for the sound of people crying. But I can't think like that, the mother continued, her voice stronger now. Because Emily loved that camp. She loved the river. She loved her friends. And I have to believe that she knew she was loved, that in those last moments, she wasn't alone. She looked out at the congregation, her eyes red but fierce. We can't bring them back, but we can honor them. We can make sure this never happens again. We can fix the systems that failed them. We owe them that. And that's exactly what Texas began to do. In the months following the flood, the state legislature passed a series of reforms aimed at improving flood preparedness and response. First, they allocated $50 million to upgrade river gauges across the state. New gauges capable of measuring higher water levels, with redundant communication systems to ensure data gets through even in severe weather. Second, they mandated that all summer camps, schools, and child care facilities in flood-prone areas develop and regularly practice evacuation plans. Inspections would be conducted annually, and facilities that didn't comply would lose their licenses. Third, they launched a public awareness campaign about flash flood risks. Billboards, TV ads, social media posts, all aimed at educating Texans about the dangers and what to do if a flood warning is issued. And fourth, they began the long, expensive process of updating flood maps across the state. Using new climate models, new rainfall data, new projections of what extreme weather looks like in a warming world. It was a start, but as Governor Gonzalez said when she signed the legislation, no amount of money, no number of laws can bring back the people we lost. All we can do is try to make sure their deaths weren't in vain. Let's return to the science for a moment, because there's something important we need to understand about flash floods in the hill country specifically. The region sits on what geologists call karst topography. That's a landscape formed by the dissolution of soluble rocks like limestone. Over millions of years, water has carved caves, sinkholes, underground rivers through the limestone. It's beautiful, but it's also dangerous. When heavy rain falls on karst terrain, the water doesn't just run off the surface. It also flows into cracks and fissures in the rock, filling underground cavities. And when those cavities fill up, the water has to go somewhere. It erupts back to the surface, often in unexpected places, adding to the flooding. This is part of why the Guadalupe River rose so fast. It wasn't just surface runoff. It was also groundwater, surging up from below, pushed by the sheer volume of rain that had fallen. Dr. Chen, the hydrologist I mentioned earlier, found evidence of this when she examined the flood zone. We saw springs that had never existed before, just appearing, water gushing out of the ground in places that had been dry for decades. The entire hydrological system was overwhelmed. Now, let's talk about the economic impact, because disasters like this don't just cost lives, they cost billions of dollars. The initial damage estimates for the Texas flood came in at around $4 billion. That includes destroyed homes, damaged infrastructure, lost businesses, agricultural losses, and the cost of emergency response and recovery. $4 billion. That's more than the GDP of some small countries. Insurance companies were swamped with claims. But here's the cruel reality. Many of the people affected didn't have flood insurance. Homeowners insurance doesn't cover flooding. You need a separate flood insurance policy for that. And because many residents didn't think they were in a flood zone, they'd never bothered to buy it. The Hernandez family, the ones whose house was completely destroyed, they didn't have flood insurance. They'd checked the maps, seen they weren't in the floodplain, and decided it wasn't necessary. Now they were facing the prospect of rebuilding entirely out of pocket, or walking away from the property altogether. FEMA stepped in with disaster assistance, but that only covers a fraction of the losses. The average FEMA grant for flood victims is around $5,000. When you've lost a house worth $200,000, $5,000 doesn't go very far. Some families decided not to rebuild. They took what little money they could get, packed up what remained of their belongings, and left the hill country altogether. The trauma was too much. The fear that it could happen again, too overwhelming. Others stayed. They rebuilt, but this time on higher ground, with flood-resistant materials, with emergency plans in place. They weren't going to let the river drive them away from the land they loved. And Camp Mystic. The camp's board of directors met in August, 2 months after the flood, to decide its future. It was a wrenching decision. The camp had been a beloved institution for nearly 80 years. But could they, in good conscience, reopen in the same location? After weeks of debate, they announced their decision. Camp Mystic would not reopen on the Guadalupe River. Instead, they would relocate to a new site, on higher ground, away from any flood risk. It would take years to build the new facilities, to recreate the magic of the old camp. But it was the only responsible choice. "We can't change what happened," the board president said in a statement, "but we can make sure it never happens again. The safety of our campers is, and always will be, our top priority." As summer turned to fall, the hill country began to heal. Slowly, painfully. The floodwaters receded, leaving behind a landscape transformed. Trees were stripped bare, their trunks scarred by debris. Riverbanks were carved into new shapes. Homes stood empty, windows broken, walls stained with mud lines, showing how high the water had risen. But life, as it always does, found a way to continue. Schools reopened, businesses rebuilt, families gathered for Thanksgiving, grateful to be together, even as they mourned the empty chairs at the table. In Kerrville, a memorial was erected in the town square, a simple stone monument engraved with the names of the 135 people who died in the flood. Fresh flowers appeared there every day, left by people who wanted to remember, who refused to let the victims be forgotten. Let me take you back to Maria Santos, the counselor who saved those girls. In the months after the flood, she struggled. She had nightmares. She couldn't sleep. She kept seeing the faces of the girls she couldn't save, hearing their voices calling for her in the darkness. She was diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. She started therapy, joined a support group for flood survivors. It helped, but the guilt was crushing. I keep asking myself, what could I have done differently? She said in an interview 6 months after the flood. Could I have saved more of them? Should I have, I don't know, made different choices? Her therapist told her something that she's trying to believe. You did everything you could. You saved lives. You're a hero. Maria shook her head. I don't feel like a hero. I feel like I failed them. But here's what I want you to understand. Maria Santos is a hero. She risked her life, again and again, to save those girls. She did more than anyone could reasonably expect. And the fact that she couldn't save them all, that's not her failure. That's the failure of the systems that should have protected them. The warning systems, the evacuation plans, the decisions made, or not made, in the hours before the flood. So, what have we learned? What does the Texas flood of 2025 teach us? First, climate change is real, and it's making extreme weather more common and more severe. We can't keep pretending that the old rules still apply. We need to update our infrastructure, our warning systems, our flood maps to reflect the new reality. Second, The last mile problem is critical. It's not enough to issue warnings. We need to make sure those warnings reach the people who need them in a format they can understand, with enough time to act. Third, normalcy bias can be deadly. Just because something has never happened before doesn't mean it won't happen. We need to take flood risks seriously, even in areas that have historically been safe. Fourth, we need to invest in resilience. That means better gauges, better communication systems, better emergency plans. It means educating the public about risks. It means making the hard decisions like relocating camps and communities out of flood zones, even when it's expensive and painful. And fifth, we need to remember the victims, not just as statistics, not just as names on a memorial, but as people, as daughters and sons, mothers and fathers, friends and neighbors. They had dreams, hopes, futures that were stolen from them. We owe it to them to do better. The Guadalupe River still flows through the Texas Hill Country. On calm days, it's beautiful, peaceful, inviting. Families still float down it on inner tubes. Kids still splash in the shallows. Life goes on, but if you look closely, you can see the scars. Trees with bark stripped away. Riverbanks carved into new shapes. And if you listen, you can almost hear the echoes of that terrible night. The night the river broke free. The night water wrote a story in blood and tears. The night 135 people lost their lives because we weren't ready. Nature doesn't care about our plans. It doesn't care about our maps, our models, our assumptions. When the skies open, when the rain falls, when the rivers rise, nature does what it's always done. It moves, it changes, it destroys and creates in equal measure. The question is, will we change? Will we adapt? Will we learn from tragedies like this one, or will we keep making the same mistakes, keep suffering the same losses, keep asking, how did this happen, when the answer is staring us in the face? The Texas Hill Country will recover. It always does. The land is resilient, the people are strong. But the memory of July 4th, 2025, that will never fade. It will live on in the stories survivors tell their grandchildren, in the empty chairs at family dinners, in the names carved into stone in the Kerrville town square. And maybe, just maybe, it will live on in the changes we make, the systems we fix, the lives we save the next time the skies open and the rivers rise. Because there will be a next time. The science is clear on that. The only question is, will we be ready? Tonight, we've traced the storm from sky to ground. We've followed the surge from trickle to torrent. We've heard the voices of survivors, the warnings of scientists, the grief of families. We've asked the hard questions and confronted the uncomfortable truths. The Texas flood of 2025 was a tragedy, but it doesn't have to be a tragedy in vain. We can honor the victims by learning, by changing, by building a future where no parent has to stand at a podium and talk about the child they lost to a flood that should have been survivable. Water never forgets, and it never forgives, but we can remember, and we can do better. For Emily and Maria's campers, and the Hernandez family, and all the others whose lives were forever changed by one terrible night. We remember, and we will do better.